Welcome. My name is Gerald Neuman, and I'm the director of the Human Rights Program here at Harvard Law School. We are here today to discuss a remarkable new book, The EU Constitution in Time of War, Legal Responses to Russia's Aggression Against Ukraine, by Professor Federico Fabbrini. This book provides an extremely informative, systematic, detailed account of what the EU has done in response to Russia's aggression and what effects that is having within EU law and how to evaluate some of the measures that have been taken and been proposed with regard to the responses that have been taken or that may be taken. And that's the subject that we're going to be hearing from. I will give, this is a very precious copy of this book. I will give it to Professor Fabbrini. And we'll be discussing this book and the related issues. But first, let me introduce the wonderful panel that we've been able to assemble. Of course, the author is the first member of the panel at the other end of the table. Federico Fabbrini is a full professor of EU law at Dublin City University. He's the founding director of the Brexit Institute and the Dublin European Law Institute. He's currently a Fulbright Schumann Fellow in the International Security Program at the Harvard Kennedy School. Immediately next to him is Professor Susan Farbstein. She is the director of the International Human Rights Clinic and a clinical professor here at HLS. Among other projects, her current work investigates and seeks justice for war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ukraine. Next to her is Alex Whiting. He's also a professor here at HLS, where he teaches rights and consults on domestic and international criminal prosecution issues. He has served in several roles in the Office of the Prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, the ICC, in The Hague, and also at the Kosovo Specialist Prosecutor's Office, also in The Hague. Immediately next to me is Mark Wu, who is the Henry L. Stimson Professor here at HLS, where he specializes in international trade and international economic law. Wu serves as the faculty director for the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University and as a faculty co-director of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. So that's a thumbnail introduction to people about whom a lot more could be said, but that would delay us from getting to the real subject of interest. Before we do that, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the International Human Rights Clinic at HLS, the Harvard Human Rights Journal, and the Harvard European Law Association. And I would like to give you my standard warning that this event is being recorded and streamed, and that therefore, if you choose to ask a question later when we turn to the audience for questions, you should just be aware of the fact that it's being recorded and streamed, as at all events that are being recorded and streamed. Thank you. And now to Professor Fabbrini.
Thank you so much, Jerry, for your kind introduction and for the invitation. I'm very grateful to the Human Rights Program and Harvard Law School for hosting today's event. I would like to thank, of course, the co-sponsors and Abadir for all the support, and I'm really honored that Susan, Alex, and Mark agreed to act as a discussant and participate in this panel. That's why I'm wearing a tie as a sign of appreciation for their presence here today. So as Professor Neuman, as Jerry said, the book is entitled The EU Constitution in Time of War. and was published by Oxford University Press last year. The book came out in Europe in February of 2025, so for the third anniversary of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, and I think it was published in the US a few months afterwards. What I would like to do in my brief remarks is quickly introduce the book. First, by clarifying what are the reasons behind it. Secondly, I would like to overview the structure and the content of the book, and then I will conclude by laying out the core arguments that I make in the volume. So I'll start with the reasons, which I think do require a bit of an explanation here. As Jerry said, I am a scholar of EU law, and as many of you will know, the European Union has been going through a series of crises in the last decade. We had the economic crisis, we had Brexit, we had the rule of law crisis, migration, COVID-19 pandemic, and then of course Russia attacked Ukraine. It really started in 2014, but on a larger scale in February 2022. So to some extent, this is the latest in a series of crises, and I had been perversely interested in the crisis affecting the EU. So it's almost a logical conclusion to start working on this topic. But I also felt that Russia's war in Ukraine represented a very special crisis for the European Union. And the reason is that at the end of the day, ultimately, the EU is a peacetime organization. The European Union was created as a project to secure peace, prevent interstate wars between its members, but it was never conceived as an organization that had to deal with the reality of warfare, hard power, military issues, partly because other organizations were designed to do that. And I'm thinking primarily of NATO, of course, in the European context. However, Russia's aggression against Ukraine, I really think represented a turning point for the EU, because for the first time ever, for the first time since the end of the Second World War, interstate conflict returned on the European continent. And to put it perhaps a bit provocatively, I think the Kantian dream of perpetual peace that had shaped European integration for 7 decades was shattered really overnight. If we go back to what is the founding document of the European Union, the Schuman Declaration, which is a bit the equivalent of the American Declaration of Independence, if you want. The Schuman Declaration clarifies that the purpose of European integration is to make war not only unthinkable, but materially impossible between European states. And if you measure the European Union by that standard over 7 decades, the success of the EU has been extraordinary. No EU state has been fighting another member of the Union since the Union has existed. However, the EU largely forgot the reality of warfare outside its borders. It, to a large extent, I would say, delegated the responsibility of taking care of security to other actors, NATO and the United States. And this is really where Russia's aggression of Ukraine changed for the first time the perception of the EU and forced the European Union to deal with the reality of hard power. In fact, as I argue in the book, the war in Ukraine is really the first time ever when the EU starts mobilizing its own machinery of government to deal with the reality of warfare. And so if my assessment is correct, we can come back to this later, then you appreciate what is the motivation behind this research, which is really to explore how the EU has handled the first war it ever experienced since its creation. And because I'm a legal scholar, I speak about the EU constitution in time of war, because my interest is really on legal powers and institutional structures. But I do need to make an obvious footnote here, which is that, as most people in the room will know, there is no such a thing as the EU Constitution with a capital C. We don't have a single document, the Constitution of the EU. We rather have treaties of the European Union that created, established, and funded the institutions. But those treaties have been interpreted by the Court of Justice of the EU as the constitutional charter of the Union. And so in academic debates in Europe, it is quite common to refer to the EU treaties as the constitution of the EU. I use the same terminology, but with the caveat which is a lowercase c constitution rather than an uppercase c constitution. But with that said, you appreciate what basically my interest is, which is to explore how the EU system of governance and system of allocated competencies has operated in wartime. And the way how the book does it, I'm moving here to sort of the quick overview of the structure, is by taking a very broad view and providing a fairly wide analysis of all the main EU policy areas which have been affected by the war. So first I look at foreign affairs and defense, clearly very important in wartime. But secondly, I also examine fiscal policy and budgetary matters. Thirdly, I consider what we call justice and home affairs, so all internal measures related to migration, criminal law enforcement, sanction, and so on. I then look fourthly at energy and industrial policy with the development of an economic security strategy and competitiveness. And finally, I also consider the renewed enlargement policy of the European Union as yet another area where the EU responded to the war. And in all of these 5 policy areas, I follow the same analytical structure, so mapping out the core measures adopted by the Union, emphasizing the consequences that these measures have for European integration, but also highlighting the challenges that they raise, both for the EU and I think for constitutionalism in the European Union. So with that said, let me come to the argument of the book. I want to keep my remarks very short because there is an August panel after me. So basically the book makes a threefold argument, which is the following. First, I argue that the EU treaties proved to be a living constitution in time of war. So when the European Union had to face the reality of warfare in Ukraine, it managed actually to exploit flexibilities in the treaties to achieve really unprecedented actions in multiple policy domains. In fact, what the EU did in response to the war, many analysts thought was impossible before 2022. And I have multiple examples of this in the volume. If you look at defense, for example, the European Union used legal authorities that it has in the field of industry to launch multiple programs of ammunition procurement and production, and then transfer these ammunition to Ukraine. In the field of sanctions, the EU adopted the most significant sanction it ever had in its history, including secondary sanction for the first time. It also introduced the first ever EU federal crime, the crime of violating sanctions against Russia. In the field of industrial policy and fiscal policy, the EU developed from scratch a new economic security strategy dealing with issues like supply chains, resilience, energy independence. And then, of course, in the field of fiscal policy, actually, the Union used the limited legal authority it has in the treaties to put together over 100 billion euros of common EU debt that is raised on the financial market and transferred to Ukraine to support it in its fight against Russia. So you can really see a great degree of flexibility here. And obviously, in my book, I'm not taking any position on the intense American discussion whether the Constitution should be interpreted as an original document or as a living document. But I can tell you, in the EU case, definitely the living constitutionalism dynamic has played out very strongly since the beginning of the war, with the institutions reinterpreting or construing legal authorities in the treaties to do unprecedented things. However, and this is the second argument that I make in the book, the war also exposed the existence of structural constraints in the EU Constitution that complicate enormously the ability of the EU to step up and deal with the reality of warfare. And to be fair, some of these structural limits, we knew them beforehand from prior crises that the EU faced, but others only became evident in wartime. And interestingly, the types of obstacles or constitutional difficulties that became visible in wartime are of two different nature. On the one hand, in some circumstances, the EU treaties provided or introduces too many constraints on government actions, effectively making it very hard, if not impossible, for the EU to respond to the challenge of war. But on the other hand, in other areas, the EU treaties, in fact, proved to be not sufficiently constraining, with lacking appropriate checks and balances to protect human rights and the rule of law in time of wars. And just to give some examples here, for example, in the first space where the treaties are too constraining, the treaties do not allow the use of the EU budget for military operations. And so even if the Union has money, it can't actually utilize those resources to defend itself, which is pretty extraordinary. And then on the governance side, many areas of EU decision-making, primarily in defense, but also in fiscal affairs, are subject to unanimity decision-making, which basically means that a single member state in the Council can delay, dilute, or ultimately veto the approval of important measures. And that has happened multiple times in military assistance missions towards Ukraine, but also in raising funds for Ukraine. And Hungary has traditionally been the state that has wielded more successfully the veto, often blackmailing the EU to get concessions on alternative fights. But behind Hungary, other states also played the same game. On the contrary, as an example of areas where the EU treaties did not introduce sufficient checks and balances, I think the issues of justice and home affairs does raise problematic aspects. The Union, as I said before, introduced multiple rounds of sanctions, but several of these sanctions were subject to only very mild judicial review by European courts. Among others, the EU prohibited offering legal assistance to Russian blacklisted on the sanction. Is that compatible with a right to fair trial, a right to a lawyer? The EU banned Tukor, a Russian television channel that was accused of being a propaganda machine for the Kremlin. Is that compatible with free speech? In fact, when those cases got in front of the court waved them out very easily without subjecting them to strict scrutiny. And beyond that, you have other EU measures which were either adopted in secrecy or entirely escaped judicial review. And I think here the question of the confiscation of Russian central bank assets, or at least the interest accumulated on the capital which is frozen in commercial banks of the EU because of the sanction, that raises questions of compliance with international law, the principle of foreign sovereign immunity, but no court was actually adjudicating those matters. Indeed, the Council approved them in a very secretive process without ever disclosing the legal text until the last minute. So if you assess all those issues together, I think there are some constitutional weaknesses that emerge here. And in the book, I make two citations. One is Abraham Lincoln, who famously said, the Constitution is not a suicide pact. And the other is Cicero, who said laws should not be silent in wartime. And as my book tries to analyze, unfortunately, both those dynamics occurred. On some occasion, the EU treaties prevented too much action, and on other occasions, they didn't subject action to sufficient checks and balances. And I think, as we teach students, the purpose of constitutionalism is exactly to enable power and to constrain it. And the two dimensions should be there, which is why the third and final argument I make in the book is that the EU needs to reform its constitutional structures moving forward, especially as this time of geopolitical, geoeconomic competition is only going to increase, and especially as NATO, which I mentioned previously, is probably unlikely to play the role it had for the last 7 decades. So there is a need to think forward how the EU can step up, but that requires reforming itself. It's not easy. This is part of the project I'm currently carrying forward as a Fulbrighter at the Kennedy School. So I'll stop here and maybe we'll come back to this in the Q&A. But thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Federico. Susan?
Okay, thank you. And as I said to Federico when I agreed to speak today, I am not an expert on the EU, but I learned quite a lot from reading your book. And what I wanted to do was sort of focus my time on the theme of justice that Federico mentioned, and sort of just say a few things briefly about the ways that I think the EU has been contributing to justice and accountability efforts for Russia's war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ukraine, and maybe take a minute to think about where it could be doing more, or where there might be open questions about what it should be doing as the war now enters its 5th year post full-scale invasion. And I guess the headline of what I'm going to say is that I think, in no small part due to the actions and support of the EU, that Russia's war in Ukraine has probably sparked the most intensive international justice efforts since the 1990s, when you see the wars in the former Yugoslavia and the genocide in Rwanda leading to the creation of the ad hoc tribunals and sort of building momentum towards the creation of the ICC itself. And I think that also the EU's response has shown that there is still political will to seek accountability for atrocity crimes, even in contexts where those atrocity crimes are being committed by one of the world's major powers. And you sort of see this playing out at 2 levels, so I'll take each in turn. I think first you see it playing out in very strong public, political, and practical commitments by the EU to support the ICC. So almost immediately after the full-scale invasion, a record number of states parties, more than 40, come together, and they jointly refer the situation in Ukraine to the Office of the Prosecutor, and that leads it to open a formal investigation in March 2022. And then just the fact of that sort of collective referral itself was pretty unusual. It allowed the court to move forward without needing a Security Council referral, which of course Russia would have blocked. And I think it also reinforced the legitimacy of the court as an institution where justice can be sought, and it sort of put the referring states on the hook in a way. Now they have to offer support, they have to offer resources, they have to offer cooperation, they have to make sure that this referral isn't going to be just an empty gesture, that it would be followed by some kind of meaningful investigation. And that's what you see. And as the investigation has continued to unfold, many European states have increased their financial contributions to the court. They've seconded staff, they've shared evidence, they've shared information, and they've taken steps to help the Office of the Prosecutor manage the scale and complexity of what is a very, very large investigation. And it's yielded 6 arrest warrants so far that we know of that have been made public. So you get the first 2 in March of 2023 against Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova, who's the commissioner on children's rights linked to the unlawful deportation and transfer of children, which is itself a war crime. And I think the Putin arrest warrant is particularly significant because it's the first against a leader of a permanent member of the Security Council. And then about a year later, in March of 24, you get 2 more arrest warrants, one against a general, one's against an admiral, for airstrikes against civilians and civilian populations, another war crime. And then in June of 24, you get 2 more arrest warrants against more senior defense leadership, the Minister of Defense and the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces, again, for the war crimes of attacking civilians and civilian objects, and this sort of funny catch-all crime against humanity of other inhumane acts. And then there's sort of a dialogue between the court and the EU where the warrants are publicly welcomed by a number of EU states. They sort of say publicly that, we and others have to take steps to execute these arrest warrants. Okay, having said that, I know that there are other folks, including perhaps other folks on this panel, who might be skeptical about how much any of this matters, given that the ICC, of course, relies on state cooperation and it doesn't have the power to actually arrest any of these people. So we know that the chances of them being arrested are probably quite slim. So, I'm happy to hear from others who might push back on the significance, but I guess I'd offer 2 reasons why I think that this matters very much. I think, one, it matters because what it's done is it's sort of normalized the idea that the EU is going to provide political and financial support to the ICC. It's made the execution of these arrest warrants at least a higher profile matter within European Union foreign policy, and I hope it's helped build the legitimacy of the international justice process project at a time when it's very much under attack. And I think, too, this matters because all of these people, but Putin especially, are now constrained by the arrest warrants, beyond the reputational costs. He and others, their world has shrunk. They can't travel in the same way. And we've seen that for Putin, where he didn't go to the BRICS summit in South Africa in 2023, and he also didn't go to the BRICS summit in Brazil in 2025 and just appeared over video. Okay, so that's the first level. I think the second level is that you've seen the EU providing critical support to the Ukrainian Office of the Prosecutor General and to domestic prosecutions efforts. So there's this EU agency for criminal justice cooperation that's kind of the hub that investigates and it coordinates, and it created a joint investigation team to focus specifically on the crimes that are being committed in Ukraine. And they've been doing a lot of important work to ensure that evidence is going to be stored and preserved properly so that it can be used, hopefully, in multiple prosecutions. They're working to try to avoid duplicating efforts, and their mandate was just extended for another 2 years in March, I think, with a focus specifically, again, on the deportation and transfer of children. Europol has been collecting information from various sources to support investigations, and the EU's just been investing in the Office of the Prosecutor General to help them document and prosecute crimes domestically, and that's really important given sort of the sheer number of investigations that they have ongoing. The latest number I've seen from Ukraine's Office of the Prosecutor General is that they have more than 200,000 cases of alleged war crimes that they're investigating, which is a pretty staggering number. And the EU's played a leadership role in creating this atrocity crimes advisory group that's sending experts who are providing trainings and advising the OPG on all facets of these investigations. There are also mobile justice teams that are working with Ukrainian, sort of like in the field with Ukrainian prosecutors to try to support their work. And again, prosecutions are moving forward at the domestic level in Ukrainian courts, mostly against sort of lower level Russian soldiers and lower level commanders, although I think there have been a handful against members of private military contractors. And again, the latest number I've seen from March is that they filed more than 800 indictments and obtained about 240 convictions, although I think only about 10% of those are in person. Mostly they're trials that are happening in absentia. So we can sort of be skeptical about like this investment of EU resources, like are we actually seeing justice here? But I guess my response would be that even trials in absentia do tell an important story about the kinds of violations that are being committed in this war. They create a public record about who's responsible. They provide some measure of symbolic recognition and acknowledgement for the victims. And then in terms of the in-person trials, a lot of the Russian prisoners of war have been exchanged for Ukrainian prisoners of war or Ukrainian civilians who have been captured. So we might sort of see that as a failure of justice. But I guess, again, what I would say in response is that I know many in Ukraine feel a really acute need to bring these folks home, particularly when conditions of detention are terrible and people are being subjected to torture or execution. So the prisoner exchanges are really sort of one of the few ways to get people back now. Maybe that's its own kind of justice. And maybe just a couple of thoughts before I hand it off to Alex, who can, tell me why I'm wrong, are that one, I guess I'd like to think that Russia's war of aggression hasn't just sparked the political will to seek justice for these specific crimes in Ukraine, but that it's also pushed the EU in the direction of supporting this more kind of multi-dimensional, multifaceted vision of justice for international crimes, regardless of where they occur. I think for me, there's an open question still about what role the EU is going to play in the peace negotiations to the extent that those continue to move forward. Historically, it's been really strong in saying that there has to be a just peace, a lasting peace, that it has to respect Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, and that they're committed to full accountability. I'm curious whether the EU will hold the line on that, or whether there might be movement to trade away some measure of justice and accountability for the sake of peace. And I think the second thing that I'm sort of interested in, or that's an open question for me, is about the extent to which the EU will use language that's not just, this is a war of aggression, these are war crimes, these are crimes against humanity, but potentially the language of genocide. So some EU member states have recognized Russian actions in Ukraine as a genocide. This was earlier in the war, sort of after Bucha and Mariupol. And the EU has increasingly been speaking about sort of the genocidal nature of the war, Russia's genocidal strategy. And, you know, I think that it also particularly been using this language with regard to the forced transfer of children. So I'm interested to see the direction of travel with regard to genocide in particular. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Alex.
Thank you. Thank you to the Human Rights Program for sponsoring this, and Jerry for moderating it, and Federico, thank you for writing this book and for being here today. Before I go on to my topic, Susan, I actually agree with virtually everything you said. I think it definitely matters, and I think that the as you said, the investment of the EU and the world, and the multi-dimensional investment, I think, is really important and a really huge step for the International Justice Project. I would just say that it's, and I think you said this yourself, it's incomplete, and I'm concerned that on the one hand, the ICC has arrest warrants for people that will likely never be arrested, and Ukraine is prosecuting people either in absentia or sending them back. And so it feels right now like incomplete justice. Maybe that's the best that can be done at the moment. But as you said, and I agree with this also, hopefully the future will take this into account when peace is achieved, that there is a more complete justice. So I'm going to continue on the justice theme, and we did coordinate this.
Yes.
Yeah, so I want to talk about the crime of aggression. And justice for the crime of aggression. And I think this is an important topic for the EU because, first of all, there's no question that the Russian attack on Ukraine was an act of aggression. Secondly, as Federico said, he described the EU as a peace power. And if you're thinking of preserving peace, focusing on how you address an act of aggression and the crime of aggression goes right to the heart of the matter. And third, the EU has had a long commitment to the International Justice Project in the ad hoc tribunals and in the International Criminal Court. So it's fitting that it would try to focus on this today. There's an interesting echo here because Federico alluded to, and so did Susan, alluded to an earlier war in Europe that didn't consume quite the same attention of Europe, but was still significant. That is the war in the former Yugoslavia. And when that war broke out, it brought people to the thinking about the crimes that were committed during World War II, and there was an echo of the Holocaust. And the world at that time, this was not just Europe, but at that time it was the whole world, turned to the creation of a tribunal following Nuremberg, the example of Nuremberg, to address the crimes in the former Yugoslavia, which then led to more ad hoc tribunals and ultimately energy for the International Criminal Court. And Madeleine Albright, when she was in the Security Council meeting that adopted the Yugoslavia Tribunal, said her first words were, there is an echo of Nuremberg in the chamber today. And there's a parallel with the war in Ukraine, because there is again an echo of Nuremberg, because of course Nuremberg, the main crime of Nuremberg, the supreme crime, as the judgment said, was the crime of aggression. And so, and now this very clear act of aggression is making us again think about whether there is a judicial tribunal response to the crime of aggression. But now, of course, it's not a world response, because Russia, one of the P5 countries, committed the act of aggression. So we have to think of more of a European response. So it's fitting for Federico's project. Now, of course, the International Criminal Court might have been an option, but prior to the Russia's attack on Ukraine, the International Criminal Court had finally integrated the crime of aggression into its statute, but under pressure from some big countries like the United States, it narrowed the jurisdiction so that it does not apply to this case, because it only applies when both the attacking country and the attacked country are members of the court. So the International Criminal Court is not an answer. So now we have to think about whether there is a possible judicial response, a new institution that could be created. And I think that for Europe, this raises, like, can Europe meet this moment? And what are the legal, institutional, and political questions that are raised by trying to create a tribunal? So Security Council is obviously not an option for creating a tribunal. Option 2 is for the General Assembly to make an agreement with Ukraine and create a tribunal that way. And that was the first proposal, and there was energy behind that idea. But that idea splintered on 2 different dimensions. The first is kind of within, you might say, within Europe, and then the second dimension was Europe and the rest of the world. So within Europe, there were a number of the big countries didn't support this idea. The G7 ultimately said that it would not support this idea, and in particular, they wouldn't support it because the idea was that having a General Assembly tribunal would be able to overcome the head of state immunity for Putin. And the major countries, the United States and major countries in Europe, particularly I think France and Germany, and obviously the UK also was behind this, didn't want to put aside the head of state immunity. And then secondly, the Global South wasn't enthusiastic about this idea because it felt like double standards. There had not been tribunals or this kind of attention paid to other kinds of aggressions. So where do you go? After that idea was put aside, didn't work, option 3 has been for the Council of Europe to make an agreement with Ukraine to establish an aggression tribunal. The US and the major states of Europe sort of splintered to the side, and they created an institution within Eurojust to kind of study and collect evidence. Not clear what that's supposed to do. But the middle and smaller states of Europe rallied around this idea. And so there is an agreement now to create this tribunal. And the EU has just taken the step of backing the agreement and committing 10 million euros to establish the first steps of this court. Now, the price that's been paid for getting this agreement has been that, number one, the court will respect the immunities of Putin and the foreign minister of both Russia and Belarus, which means that the court can investigate and propose an indictment, but it cannot be confirmed until they are out of power, which is a high price to pay, right? And then the second is that it can do trials in absentia, which was very controversial. So now we have this court that is starting to be put together. Within Europe, the smaller states, the Baltic states in particular, are very enthusiastic, whereas I think the bigger states are less enthusiastic about this project. And now, I guess for Federico, I have the question about whether you think Europe can meet this moment with this tribunal. Is this tribunal feasible? Can Europe itself hold together? And how does Europe navigate with the rest of the world on this topic, both with the Global South, but also with the United States and other countries? And has the fact that the US has now, of course, committed acts of aggression in Venezuela and Iran, does that change the picture? Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Mark?
I'm going to pull our conversation away a little bit from the justice issue and thinking about how this war of aggression will be dealt with in the courts once we have some form of peace settlement. And what I want to focus on instead is on the economic statecraft lens through which Europe has attempted to meet this moment. I want to first start by saying I think Professor Fabbrini has highlighted a very important question here about whether the EU project is simply a project for peacetime or whether the EU project is one that can be transformed for not just a time of war, but also through a sustained period of geopolitical competition. And in the course of that geopolitical competition, what I want to suggest in my remarks is that Europe right now is going through an identity crisis. That is especially a statement to all of the bright European students I see here in the audience, because of course, this is a crisis that you will have to navigate in your lifetime and to make some very difficult calls. But I want to suggest that just as the European constitutional moment was structured first in the 1950s and 60s in response to a geopolitical moment and then was reimagined in the 1990s for a new geopolitical moment, it will require that you, as we step into yet another new geopolitical moment, rethink the overall nature of this union and this community. And I think the challenge is perhaps as large, if not larger, than that of the triumphalist moment of the 1990s, when it was much easier to reimagine this project in light of a triumph, as opposed to now reimagining this project in light of a threat. What I want to start with is to say, I think what's interesting, if one thinks about how economic statecraft is normally forged in most countries, you certainly have the economic arm, which oversees all of the, say, for example, the finance ministries or the treasuries, as well as the trade ministries and so forth. You have that clearly under the authority, although sometimes shared competency within the EU itself. And then you certainly have the courts acting as an arm to look at that division of those competencies and how those authorities are being exercised by the commission and other actors. So that part looks very much like any other normal actor. The part that I think is difficult to think about is usually those economic actions are taken in light of a foreign policy or security objective. And what is interesting here is that foreign policy arm of the EU is nascent, or one might argue very much underdeveloped. If you look at just who has claimed a type of authority throughout the course of this war, it's very much President von der Leyen herself. It's this council of foreign ministers trying to forge a common foreign policy. You certainly see those types of fissures, and those fissures run much greater than what we would think of in other types of federalist types of structures. And so I think this does raise the whole overall question over, do we see this as a common foreign policy project or not? Certainly you have others who are at the front lines of possibly facing an invasion, looking at a threat, saying they are on wartime economic footing, why aren't we? Turning back to other member states, where if you go through those member states, it feels like this is business as usual with a war happening on our outskirts that doesn't exactly concern us. And I think that foreign policy division is perhaps as extreme as we would think of here in the United States with regards to the immigration crises and our border states as opposed to others who are further from our border, except this time it's actually a physical security threat with regards to several of the different member states who have had a history of being invaded nonetheless. The other part, though, I think beyond the foreign policy part is, of course, the military arm. And I think, Federico, you alluded to this, right? That part sits very much within NATO, and that part sits as very much of a shared alliance with the United States. And that question, I think, is increasingly coming into play. Interestingly, not because of this war, because in the aftermath of the war, perhaps that was as tight as ever, but in the course of the events of the past year. But that, of course, does leave a question to say, are you going to shape your economic statecraft policies? How do you shape those in light of the fact that there is not a clear directive with regards to the foreign policy and with regards to the military security policy? that's not even being shaped entirely by within the political structures. And so I think what's interesting to look at all of this is this, the point that I'll allude to is where it comes to very simple yes-no decisions or where it comes to sort of one-time actions. We have seen, as you mentioned, right, with regards to do we freeze or do we not? Do we allocate these funds this way or do we not? These types of one-time types of actions. We have perhaps seen more aggressive actions by the EU than one might have expected, and we've seen the courts perhaps respond to this in a way that outside of a wartime context, if this were being done for something else, the courts might have responded differently, and it'll be interesting to think about what does that mean as far as the next time this is done. Will this only be done in this type of context or not? Is this setting up some type of a bifurcation? But what I want to highlight, I think, where the failure comes apart on these economic statecraft actions are where it involves some type of an actual strategy, where the economic statecraft is not part of a one-time do we do this or do we do that type of reactive action, but where it's forged in light of some type of a strategy. And so I know while there was a lot of applause in terms of just how quickly the EU acted, especially in the first 3 months after the war on the economic front and particularly on the sanctions front, much of that strategy was forged as a shared strategy, and some might argue even in Washington, driven strategy in the first 3 months prior to the start of that war. And where perhaps Brussels, or one could argue the major capitals within the EU, have wanted to differ from the United States as part of that, that NATO component has made it very difficult to think about that. And it's also created a frustration where that action has not happened quite as quickly. And so let me just highlight a couple of those other types of fronts as a contrast to what we may have seen in the sanctions or in the asset freeze category. The war itself introduced a new term into our lexicon, but this was a European forged term, which is de-risking. Right? And this idea of de-risking, which came about from the EU's own strategy, then did highlight, of course, a sustained strategy over the course of time. But it's simply a sort of a risk-based strategy, much like much of the precautionary principles that are taken within the European Union, without a clear strategy as to what happens should the catastrophe itself happen. And so we can look at even just, say, the pace of economic resiliency or de-risking apart from energy supplies, and we can look at how that responded to the current shock, right, where there is then the catastrophic or near catastrophic element, and then how quickly one can act on that. And I think that is a part that you can't fault the Commission itself for not being able to execute. It pretty much went as far as it could given its authorities, but it really does require a foreign policy and a military component to highlight what is the response in order to then think about what is the economic response to that. And so in the US these days, we have touched on these ideas of strategic decoupling as parts of de-risking, but the other term, which I think has started to take hold, and there's a new book coming out with all this, is this idea of avalanche decoupling. So in the event of a catastrophe, how quickly can you think of this as an avalanche where you then use all these economic instruments to decouple? And on this front, it's not clear at all that the EU authorities themselves have the authority to enact that type of strategy, nor is it clear that there could be any types of coordination in order to make all that happen. And I think that realization has led to some real soul searching in terms of where does the EU sit on all this. Is it really an autonomous strategic actor and therefore it wants to use its economic statecraft very much independently from the US? Is it aligned with the US as far as the security arm is concerned? Is it looking to de-risk from the US strategically, but it cannot, until then it needs to align its economic actions there? I think these are very much open questions, but these are not questions that can be solved, I want to suggest, without getting to the heart of what is the common foreign policy project and what is the common security project. And what I'll close with is, at the end of this, this also ties back to what is the common fiscal project. And that has been a question which has troubled, right, sort of this constitutional nature. And each time we've undergone a major revision or of how we think about this constitutional division of powers, it has also tied to very much a fiscal revision in terms of this project. So I think for all of us, these questions are large ones, but they turn very much for this next generation of Europeans to think about what is the nature of this geopolitical moment. We search about analogies, and I love that this group is so optimistic in the sense of talking about yet another post-Nuremberg moment, right? But we also have thought about, is this piece going to have echoes of Munich? Are we seeing echoes of the great powers competition in the breakdown of a Westphalian order? Are we going through yet another period of a 7 years war followed by a series of political revolutions to come? And so I think I leave those questions to all of you to ponder, but to say it's important that you forge a common answer in the course of the European political economy, because how those answers play out will have ripple effects for the rest of us as to whether or not justice can be carried out in the wake of this aggression, which has yet to be met with some type of righteous response. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Well, we have a extremely rich set of responses to the book and the subject matter that the book raises. I'd like to give Federico an opportunity to add any comments with regard to what's been said before. And then there is a question that I would like to ask, but let me hand the mic to Federico first before I come in with my little question.
Thank you so much, Jerry. And let me thank really Susan, Alex, and Mark for the wonderful comments and for being so gracious to engage so deeply with my work. I'm really humbled and honored about that. I might try to pick up one point for each of you without any pretension of being comprehensive in responding to your points. But I think you raised some very good ones. So maybe going in the same order, I think Susan, you highlighted how the EU has played an important role in contributing to justice. I did notice a bit too much of optimism, perhaps, in yours as a European. And I would say that I think one issue that remains problematic is that the EU has all this ambition of investigating, prosecuting the crimes, but effectively has never moved the conversation to how to make that real. And I guess that's a point that perhaps Mark was also highlighting, this tension between sort of the ambitions that you outline in a declaration and the means that you can put on the table to get there. And it's obviously a tension that has been looming for at least 3 decades in EU foreign policy, but I think it's becoming very, very visible here. And that takes me maybe to the point I wanted to make to Alex, where again, I'm grateful also for the explanation you gave about this tribunal, special tribunal for the crime of aggression on Ukraine. I didn't cover it in the book because it was adopted after that, but definitely the EU, essentially it drafted it. I mean, it's EU lawyers that within the Council of Europe really came up with the plan and conceived it and drafted it. And as you mentioned, there is already a commitment to provide 10 million euros to support it, although we know the Dutch are asking 16 million euros to host it. So that already creates some million euros of deficit. But I think, can Europe meet the moment, which was your final question? And as a famous Irish poet said, it's very hard to make predictions, especially if they regard the future, Oscar Wilde. But I do see competing trends, because on the one hand, you have a positive dynamic, and here the election in Hungary last week is really an important development. Actually, Hungary systematically opposed all EU measures to support Ukraine on the justice front. Hungary is not a party to most Council of Europe measures that were adopted to help Ukraine. Even the use of the ICC and the special arrangement that were done between Eurojust and the International Criminal Court is partially to overcome the role of Hungary, which has a member state, has a seat in Eurojust itself. So the fact that Orban is out might create some openings. And sorry, I forget to mention this. Hungary actually, under Orban, started the process of withdrawing from the ICC, which in the EU, most EU lawyers like myself would have thought that being a member of the ICC is actually a requirement for membership of the EU. We ask this to accession countries. You can't start the process of joining the European Union if you're not a member of the ICC, and now Hungary, under Viktor Orban, was pulling out of the court. So the political regime change there signals, I think, potentially a positive development, but I do think that the geostrategic change of approach of the United States is having a huge consequence. The US played a behind-the-scenes supporting role from 22 to 25, including in designing this special tribunal. Since Trump returned to office, that has changed. And you can see that at the diplomatic level, the absence of American support on this project is now slowing down the process of moving forward. So you mentioned the situation basically in June of 2025. The Council of Europe and Ukraine concluded an agreement establishing this special tribunal, and there is a statute that creates the court and governs it. But actually, this agreement to enter into force requires a second treaty, which is the so-called large partial agreement between Council of Europe members, which is designed to finance the court, but to create also the political consensus behind it. And states have been dragging their foot on these crucial steps. So again, we go back to this. Yeah, we want to establish justice, secure accountability, provide a modicum of redress to Ukraine, but then there is a lack of means to do that. On Mark, thanks a lot for your thoughts, including for emphasizing sort of the precedence of these moments in the 50s, in the 90s, when the EU tried to reimagine itself. I think you hit on a key point, and I wanted to emphasize specifically that when I was discussing with my publisher, I decided that the book ought to end in October 2024, so just ahead of the US election. I couldn't predict the outcome, obviously, but I could see that if Trump was going to win, that would have major consequences. And I think, the points that you were making, Mark, are exactly spot on, because when Biden was in office, you did have a kind of an alignment between the EU foreign policy and economic strategy and what the Americans were doing. Now I think the EU is trying to navigate its new sort of economic statecraft in a context which is much more hostile, because the Americans are not providing the security backup on which Europe relied for so long. And so the risking plays out towards Russia, towards China, but also now towards the United States. Is that really successful? I think the EU has largely failed to achieve a good balance there. I talk briefly in the book about the trade dimension also of EU foreign policy. Clearly, again, it's not in this book, but the agreement between the EU and the US last summer in Turnberry in Scotland. I mean, the EU was forced to make huge economic concession because, again, it depended on the US for the security side. So I think the project of European integration has to scale up across the board to become meaningful. And the references to the 1950s, I think, is very significant, and it comes down my alley because it's really what I'm working now in my project as a Fulbrighter at the Kennedy School. I have been making the case that we should revive some of the treaties that were drafted in the early days of European integration, including the treaty establishing the European Defense Community, which was one of the very first treaty together with the coal and steel community and the economic community. And it created a common army integrated into NATO, but with a fiscal authority to issue debt much more easily than it's possible in the EU, industrial procurement, with basically something similar to the Defense Production Act, and really a government that could decide on foreign policy and defense issue in a federal way, so without the confederal dynamics of unanimity. And of course, there are pressure to go in that direction. The Draghi report a year ago really indicated that path, but of course you also have resistance, and that's really the constitutional conundrum in which the EU is at the moment. But I'll stop here so that, Jerry, you can ask me also your question.
Well, thank you. Actually, given the time, I would like to give the audience the opportunity to ask some questions, and I'll postpone mine for later. Let me also mention Professor Whiting is going to have to leave because he has a class to teach at 1:30. So maybe if you have questions that you want Professor Whiting to address, they should be the first ones that get asked. Are there questions from the floor? Everyone is totally persuaded, regardless of disagreements among the panel. Could I ask you here? Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes, we'll let the faculty wait.
Thank you so much. My name is Alexandra Tarhanova. I'm a visiting fellow at the Center for European Studies, and I do research on occupation and displacement in Ukraine. I really appreciate. I've learned so much from the panel, and I wanted to maybe pick up on some of the issues that were brought by the panel for you, and then formulate it as a question, Federico. So, first of all, I wanted to ask maybe if you could expand a little bit on if there are any legal preconditions, prerequisites that you could see for their future possible military aggression on EU soil. Is there anything that you noticed in your research that is there or isn't? And the second question, I really
to preclude aggression by Russia against one of those.
To react to it.
Or to react to it.
Not only in a military sense, but also in terms of joint response, in terms of civil infrastructure, transportation, energy, cooperation on non-military in non-military sense. And the second question, I really appreciate, Susan, what you said on the role of the Ukrainian courts and Ukraine as a state in response to this in joint efforts with the European courts. And so I wanted to push you on that as well. If Ukrainian functioning justice system and legal system and state features as a partner at all in your research and what you found. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Could I ask, though, could you clarify, when you're talking about response to aggression, are you talking about the response to the current aggression against Ukraine, or are you talking about response to future aggression against the EU or one member of the EU itself?
Exactly, the second.
The second. Thank you.
Future possible.
Daniel, the microphone's coming your way.
Thank you so much. This was a wonderful panel. I really appreciate it. I want to just ask a bit about other aggressions sort of going on in the world today, which I know we've touched on, and sort of how you see specifically European Union policies adapting to those aggressions or addressing them. So obviously we have aggressions that are well known, which were just mentioned. But then, as someone who works primarily on Rwanda and DRC, that's an issue in which I think arguably the European Union has been quite inconsistent. Trade deals with Rwanda remain in place. Rwanda continues to receive substantial European Union funding for its military operation in Mozambique. So I'm curious as to how all of you see European Union policy changing broadly in response to aggression. And obviously that relates to Alex's point about Iran and Venezuela.
Federico,
You should
go
ask
first.
the question too.
Let me save my question for later, or I can raise it with you separately, because I think it's more important that we get response to the questions we already have.
Alex, Susan, Mark, you want to go first?
You go first.
You're the star of the show.
Okay, well, I was hoping you would save me on this one.
We're here for you.
Just kidding. No, thanks to Alexander and Daniel. Great question. So on the first one, Alexandra, I didn't talk about it, but thanks for the softball, perhaps. But the EU actually has a mutual defense clause in its own treaties, which is similar to Article 5 of the NATO treaty. So if one member of the EU is attacked, for example, let's say by an imaginary country called Russia, then that would trigger the provision of the treaty, which in terms of legal consequences is much more committing towards a response by the other states than actually Article 5 of the NATO treaty. However, the reality is the EU still lacks, as we were saying previously, the capabilities to back up sort of the ambition of that clause. Things are developing fairly quickly, I would say, especially since the return of Trump in the White House. But we are still a long way to go for the EU to be capable to take care of itself, even though you will know it, the Union also entered into joint security commitments with Ukraine, which technically oblige the EU to continue helping Ukraine in case the war drags on, and that has been honored from the EU side, albeit reluctantly and slowing most of the time. Daniel, thanks for your question. It's a great point. There are several examples of double standards. I think you're right, and I don't think it's inappropriate to say that the EU perception of sort of wars and crimes of aggression has been different depending on who operated them and where geographically. But I would agree with what was said previously, that I think the fact that, you know, for 4 years, the EU has been complaining that Russia breached Article 2 of the UN Charter, committing what is arguably the greatest crime under the UN system, aggression, and now you have the US doing the same. It kind of weakens the argument that we want to restore the international legal order and respect principle. And where do we move forward from that is... It's difficult to say, but my worry is that we were talking about this on another excellent human rights program panel with Alex as a speaker. I'm concerned that the framework of international law is slowly disintegrating on core issues like aggressions, war crimes, crimes against humanity, possibly genocide. And then that has a spillover effect. For example, we are discussing increasingly in Europe about nuclear proliferation. Well, nuclear proliferation is prohibited under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but of course, if you violate international law on this, why can't we violate international law on that and develop nuclear weapons if we feel the American security umbrella is not there? So I think we, at least as scholars and lawyers, we need to make the case to reaffirm the centrality of certain principles, because it might have not been perfect, but it's the world that has allowed us to live where we are for the last 7 decades. I hope I'm answering that.
I would just add on the crime of aggression that the crime of aggression is both part of this larger story about international law and retreat from international law, and then it has its own story and its own challenges, and of course. The crime of aggression was the one crime that it was the main crime at Nuremberg, but it didn't feature in any of the ad hoc tribunals, and it didn't originally feature even in the International Criminal Court, and it was the International Criminal Court was slow to embrace it, and then, as I said, when it embraced a very compromised version of it. So there has been a kind of lack of enthusiasm for the crime of aggression from since Nuremberg, really, and I think the reason is what is kind of what you put your finger on, is that it's very the acts of aggression and the crime of aggression is very intertwined with political questions, and it's very unlike with the war crimes against humanity and genocide. Those I think can be more easily separated from the political questions. It's much harder with the crime of aggression, and I think so. I wouldn't lump these all together. They're not going to all have the same fate. I think the crime of aggression it's never really taken off, and now it's run into a wall. If you imagine a bird, right? And whereas the other crimes, I think, have a much different trajectory, and I think even though they're blowing in the wind, they are still going to continue flying. How'd you like that? Yeah, I unfortunately have to go. because I have to teach. So thank you.
And I think that's the moment that I should use to say, please join me in thanking the panel. Professor Fabbrini and I will speak privately.